Today's discussion will be presented in three sections since we are recording the session for a radio broadcast on Federal News Radio 1500 AM. Feel free to post questions and comments during the session, and we'll try to get them answered online. We are particularly pleased to welcome our moderator, Tom Temin, anchor of the Federal Drive on Federal News Radio 1500 AM. Let me turn over the reins to Tom to begin today's discussion.
Well, thanks for joining us. I want to talk about our theme today, choosing the right platform at the right time based on cost, risk, and mission need has made the hybrid cloud approach a compelling choice for some federal agencies. Each option, public or private, exclusive or multi-tenant, brings challenges, and it's not necessary to make a choice of one or the other. Instead, agencies are considering their security needs, the nature of the data and the applications they're deploying, and whether the material is classified. Those are some of the considerations when choosing the best option for cloud. The hybrid approach brings its own challenges, and that's what we're going to explore today. Our guests are Gerard Shelak. He's Director of the Technical Services Division in the Office of Citizen Services and Innovative Technologies at the GSA. Eric Simon, he's the Systems Expert in the Cloud Computing Program at NIST. And Gunnar Hellickson, Chief Strategist in Red Hat's U.S. Public Sector Group. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. And let's start with that idea of the choice, the process by which agencies get to what they are going to do with cloud. And Gerard, we're going to start with you, since I consider GSA on all sides of the cloud. You are negotiating contracts for clouds on behalf of federal agencies. You are a user of cloud for GSA's own purposes, and you're involved in the security through the FedRAMP process. So everywhere you look at cloud, GSA is there at some point. So talk about the decision process for what model works best in which situations.
Right. Well, specifically in the Office of Citizen Services and Communications, where I work, we're already 100% committed to the cloud. We migrated all of our applications into a cloud environment back in 2009. And we were working with the Recovery Board at that stage, but also we brought USA.gov and our other family of websites over into a cloud environment. And we've actually gone through a second iteration of that. We're on our second cloud provider at this point. So we've also lived through not only migrating from a traditional hardware environment, running servers out of the basement at 1800 F Street, into a cloud, but also migrating from one cloud service provider to another service provider.
And that's something that worries a lot. That's a question that comes up, is what if we don't like our cloud provider? How do we move along?
Right. Well, a lot of cloud implementations now are infrastructure as a service. And, you know, if you look at what infrastructure as a service is, it does remove the hardware layer, but you still end up having to manage those servers as if they were a real server. So the migration aspect, and there was no magic to it. I mean, it was still a lot of traditional work that went on in getting backups of data and redeploying and reconfiguring servers and redeploying applications in the new provider space.
So there's plenty of work for the tech staff to do.
Yes, that tech staff doesn't go away. Some of what we did earlier before we were in the cloud environment with virtualization, which we were responsible for that layer, and that actually increase the workload when you get down to it. I mean, we got a lot of efficiencies in terms of how we were able to utilize our hardware by consolidation. We went through a lot of data center consolidation, but it adds a whole other responsibility in managing that virtualized layer. So when you move into a cloud, a real cloud environment, that's handled by the vendor. So that really frees you up to actually reinvest more in more mission-oriented or strategic work.
So do you have things that are still in-house and in the cloud? Are you hybrid? I mean, how would you describe what it is you've ended up with at this point?
Yes, again, speaking just about Office of Services, when I initially pondered that question, I thought, well, we're not hybrid. But when I thought more about it, we are to some extent, and maybe even stretching the concept of hybrid. We have different providers that provide us with the compute and the database versus the content delivery network versus file store. So, there's a little bit of hybridness there. But I would even extend it a little bit so we have into the development environment. While maybe the traditional definition might not include that, since it's not directly interacting as those other environments are. There is right now a manual process of moving things from a development environment, a cloud-based and sandbox, into the production environment. And I think that as we move forward and as the industry moves forward, what we're going to see is that there will be tools where you can manage across the different service providers that will allow us to actually manage all of those environments through one portal and manage deployments and manage governance, manage cost and chargebacks.
Okay, and Eric, at NIST, you're kind of the people that tell us what the word cloud means in the first place and what all the subvariants mean.
Right.
So what do you see when agencies come to you? What are they asking, and what do you tell them with respect to a good decision process for what kind of cloud model they should use?
That's a really good question. So we're not purchasing clouds within our cloud computing program, but we are trying to assist U.S. government agencies in migrating to the cloud. First part of the decision-making process is understanding what your high-level goals and lower-level goals are, mapping those to the system requirements that you need in the services that you purchase. Then you want to be able to compare those system requirements to the service capabilities of different service providers. Once you've chosen the service that you want to go with, then you need to have those requirements spelled out in your agreements between the provider and you as the customer. Specifically for cloud, it's the service level agreement that's rather important. And finally, the final piece of the puzzle is being able to actually measure the service once it's in operation to make sure that the agreement is being met and therefore your requirements are being met.
So the SLA has to have a back-end mechanism to know that you're getting what it is that's in there.
The SLA needs to be matched with measurements that allow you to check and verify this. And it's actually all tied together by metrics that allow you to define what the measurements are, define what the concepts are, and you use that in your system requirements, you use that in the SLA, and then to make the measurements so that you can compare things throughout the whole process.
So in this, as in every type of government acquisition, it starts with requirements.
Yes. And not just government, private industry as well.
All right. So, Gunnar, when you're looking across agencies from the point of view of Red Hat, what do you see? What are they struggling with respect to moving ahead on this? Because I think there's a long way to go versus the promise here.
Yeah, sure. So I think that Gerard's story is actually really similar to most of the stories that I've heard, right? It's people approach virtualization and cloud primarily as a way to reduce capital expenses, right? Just pack more stuff onto a server. And they find that when they want to use public clouds, which are cheaper, more flexible, more elastic, they find that they're actually not saving themselves too much. They may be saving money on the capital expenses side, but they're actually increasing expenses on the operating expenses side, and that goes doubly true when they want to leave a cloud provider, right? It's hard to take stuff that's on-premise and move it into somebody else's environment. That's always been true. And I think if there's one great thing about this push towards cloud in the federal government, it's this renewed attention to exit strategies in IT procurements. We spend a ton of time, and most of the FAR is focused on how to enter a particular technology, right? How to acquire it. We spend almost no time thinking about our exit strategies for it. And when you're talking about moving to a cloud, if you really want to take advantage of the elasticity and the flexibility and the as a service aspect of it, you need to make sure that you know how to leave a service as easily as you entered it.
And I just wanted to touch about on that topic of moving servers. I think Gerard talked about you still have to manage the servers, and I presume that's even if they're virtual servers. And so why is it difficult to move a virtual server, a virtual machine from one cloud to another? Isn't it just like dragging a file from one folder to another?
Yeah, sure, it could be, if you want. I think a lot of the difficulty comes from not necessarily the technology or even incompatibilities, but it's the processes and the procedures, right? Eric mentioned the idea of, and I think Gerard mentioned this as well, is the idea of having a management tool that can span all the different environments that you're working in, right? So if I'm using Google Apps and I'm using Amazon's GovCloud and I'm using a VMware infrastructure internally, maybe I'm using a Red Hat Enterprise Virtualization infrastructure internally, I'm now talking about 4 different management tools. I've trained people on 4 different ways of doing things, and moving between them is non-obvious, right? Unless you have a layer of abstraction that sits on top of them that allows you not just to move the files from one folder to another, but also to move the people and processes from one place to another. That becomes really important.
And how do you know that nothing's left behind? I guess maybe that's part of that equation too.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, you can use.
I've heard about fragments of files being left behind, or pointers that could be a cybersecurity risk. Is that the case?
Sure. Yeah, it could be. I mean, these are not new problems, though, right? I mean, these aren't problems that are specific to cloud. These are problems that you had moving from one hosting provider to another, right? Cleaning up after yourself, wiping disks, making sure that you've collected all the servers that you've run. So really, we're talking about. It's the management problem. It's the same management problem we've always had. It's just in newer environments, right?
All right, and Gerard, talking about the SLAs, the service level agreements. I guess that's an important part of that's how you express what your requirements are. What have you learned over the years with respect to making sure the requirements and the SLA line up, and how does GSA measure it?
Well, I think one of the lessons is that the reliability and availability is really tied to the application and the quality of the application, and not necessarily the underlying cloud service provider. They can provide us an SLA where that VM is going to be there, but you need to architect it, first of all, to fail over to another region in the event that there's a failure at the primary site. But beyond that, I think there are how well that virtualization layer is managed. I think it's critical. I mean, there are things similar to paging and swapping for contention of resources can happen if it's not well managed, and that really has a detrimental impact on the performance and availability of applications.
So it really backs up pretty far upstream into the agency before you get to the cloud to make sure it's all going to work for you. You said the application quality and architecture.
Yeah, I think you need to think about architecting your solution as a cloud-based solution, and it's hard to retrofit some applications into the cloud. So you need to start up front, just like you need to bake security, and I think you need to bake cloud architecture in from the front.
And Eric, I've heard that said that the idea of failover should a region, and this happens with cloud providers, sometimes a section of the country or one big data center will go down. And some companies have a really great reputation for being able to work around that. I think the example I heard recently was Netflix. They can reconstitute an entire instance of their whole system, which is vast, in a couple of hours if they lose a major data center, and they do use commercial cloud providers. So what does NIST say about that, the whole idea of failover, which is really all about availability to the end user?
That's really up to the individual providers to be able to communicate to you what they're able to do in the case of failover and what sort of reliability and resiliency they can provide. It's very important to understand what they'll do. This is also very unclear and very murky waters when you're talking cloud, because as Gerard was talking about, if you're buying infrastructure as a service and then building your own services on top of it, you're responsible for some of that. Mm-hmm. If you're buying software as a service where you've passed almost all the responsibility over to the cloud service provider, they're going to be responsible, and then you have to have a lot more trust. And one of the challenges is this changes on a case-by-case basis. So you really have to look at what your responsibilities are and what the provider's responsibilities are, and make sure both entities are capable of meeting those responsibilities.
So, Gunnar, it sounds like there's a middle region there between the bare hardware and the application interface, which you were talking about earlier, that virtualization layer, that middleware layer, that's the difficulty. Mm-hmm. Correct?
Yeah. Well, I think about it as a spectrum. We're trained. I think anyone who's worked in kind of enterprise hardware and software for the last 20 years, we've been well trained for this kind of building for perfection, right? This kind of N+1 redundancy. Let's get it perfect, and 5 nines of uptime, and the rest of it. That lives on one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum are these systems like Netflix and the Chaos Monkey, right? Where Netflix Netflix has software that runs around and deliberately unplugs networks and turns off servers just to make sure that the application developers know that they can't rely on anything, right? So they build the resilience, as Gerard was saying, build the resilience into the application. I think one of the challenges for agencies is figuring out where a particular workload lives on that spectrum, right? Is this going to be something that's built to be perfect, or is it something that's built just to be resilient? And you're going to make decisions on platforms, infrastructure, and providers based on where you live on that spectrum.
And just not to get too deep in the weeds, but I will anyway.
Sure.
In client-server applications that you host yourself, databases have always been designed for syncing right away, dual phase commit and all these other phrases they have, but you can rely on your database to be the latest version. In the cloud, that model changes a little bit. And so when you have a failover situation, that management console you talked about, is there a way of handling the situation so that you know that whatever your latest version of the data is in fact what's there that's being fed up to your users? Right.
Well, I think this management console, Cloud Forms is the name of the product. In this case, what it does is provide a way of modeling all of your different systems, right? Whether they're built for resilience or whether they're built for perfection, it allows you to model them inside the tool and then take these templates and deploy them onto whatever system you like. The advantage there is, as you mentioned earlier, is just the visibility and the discoverability of the tools that you have, right? So you're not losing track of things. So that if you are no longer using a particular server, you know when you're not using that server, so you're not paying for it any longer. Some of the basic blocking tackling stuff, which is really you must be this tall to ride this ride of cloud. If you don't have those kinds of tools in place, if you don't have the way of enforcing the SLAs that Eric mentioned, you're in real trouble. That's about it.
On that note, we're going to take a break. Our guests today are Gunnar Hellickson. He's the Chief Strategist in Red Hat's U.S. Public Sector Group. Eric Simon, Systems Expert in the Electronic Information Group at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and Gerard Sheilak. He's Director of the Technical Services Division in the Office of Citizen Services and Innovative Technologies at GSA. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin, here on Building the Hybrid Cloud panel discussion, sponsored by Red Hat, Federal News Radio 1500 AM, and federalnewsradio.com.